September 1944. The Gothic Line, Italy. For the German soldiers of the 278th Infantry Division, their position on the ridge felt invulnerable. Machine guns covered every approach from the valley below, but their true security was at their back, a sheer, vertical rock face considered impassable by any army. As a cold, rainy dawn broke, they waited for the frontal assault that never came. Instead, chaos erupted from behind them. Shouts and grenade blasts from within their own perimeter. Silent figures were suddenly among them, appearing as if they had climbed out of the solid stone itself, turning the fortress into a trap. This wasn't a myth. It was a documented military operation, executed by a single company of the 1st Battalion, 9th Gurkha Rifles. Their target was a strongpoint that had already repelled multiple, costly Allied attacks. The question is not one of bravery, but of tactical genius. How could fewer than 200 men achieve what entire battalions could not? To understand their radical solution, we must first understand the brutal problem they faced, the fortress known as the Gothic Line. By late summer 1944, the Allied advance in Italy had devolved into a brutal, inch-by-inch struggle. After the liberation of Rome, optimism had been high, but that optimism died in the mountains. The British 8th Army had slammed into a defense system engineered to be unbreakable, the Gothic Line. This was not a simple trench. It was a 200-mile wide, 10-mile deep belt of fortifications, integrated with the most formidable defensive weapon in Italy, the terrain itself. The Germans, under Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, had spent nearly a year turning the northern Apennine Mountains into a fortress. They held the high ground, a series of jagged ridges and peaks that gave their artillery observers a perfect view of every valley and road below. Every likely approach was pre-sighted for mortars and artillery. Every slope was a designated killing zone, swept by the interlocking fire of MG-42 machine gun nests, dug into rock and reinforced with concrete. For an attacker in the valleys, it was a tactical nightmare. Tasked with punching a hole in this eastern sector was the 4th Indian Infantry Division. These were not new recruits. They were hardened veterans of the North African desert and the ferocious battle for Monte Cassino. Yet here, their experience and courage were not enough. Standard military doctrine, artillery bombardment followed by infantry assault, was failing with horrific results. Division reports from August and early September speak of attacks being stopped cold, battalions pinned down and decimated long before reaching their objectives. The strategic clock was ticking. Every day the line held, the Germans brought in more reinforcements. With the first autumn rains turning the ground to mud and winter approaching, the window to break through was closing. The entire Italian campaign, and the immense sacrifices made to get this far, were in jeopardy. In the command posts, a desperate realization took hold. Frontal assaults were suicide. They had to find another way. The answer was not found in planning a bigger attack. It was found by changing the question. Instead of asking how to break the German line, the command of the 4th Indian Division began asking where it was weakest. The focus shifted from artillery schedules to reconnaissance reports. Patrols probed the German perimeter at night. Aerial photographs were analyzed, not for gun emplacements, but for gaps, for the overlooked, the ignored, the impossible. And they found one. On the flank of a key German position, point 343, which overlooked the town of Tavoleto, was a deep, narrow gully. It was a sheer, treacherous scar in the rock, so steep the Germans considered it impassable and reportedly used it to dispose of trash. A radical decision was made. C Company of the 1st Battalion, 9th Gurkha Rifles, would attempt a silent, nighttime ascent. It was an all-or-nothing gamble. One slip, one dislodged stone, would betray them. They would be annihilated in the gully, unable to retreat. The logic of overwhelming force was abandoned for the logic of absolute surprise. As darkness fell on September 3, 1944, the plan was set in motion. Under the command of Major J.A.I. Fillingham, the 180 men of C Company gathered in the pre-dawn gloom of September 4th. These were Gurkhas, soldiers recruited from the hill tribes of Nepal, serving in the British Indian Army. Their familiarity with mountainous terrain was second nature. But this was not a traditional climb. It was a silent infiltration into the heart of an enemy fortress. The orders were explicit: travel light. Each man carried his rifle, bandoliers of ammunition, and a handful of grenades. Heavy packs, entrenching tools, and any gear that could rattle or clang was left behind. The only other piece of equipment was personal and essential: the forward curving knife known as the kukri. On this mission, its primary purpose was not as a weapon, but as a tool for silence, to cut handholds, clear brush, and secure a grip where none existed. Their greatest weapon was one they carried in their minds: absolute discipline. The ascent began in total darkness, under the cover of a relentless, driving rain. The gully was less a path and more a vertical watercourse of mud and slick, broken rock. It was a grueling, agonizingly slow process, Men used their bare hands to find purchase, fingers digging into the cold mud, testing each rock before putting their weight on it. Where the rock face was too sheer, a kukri would be drawn, its tip carefully worked into a crevice to create a temporary anchor point. This was a climb of inches, not feet. The only sounds were the drumming of the rain, the gasp of strained breaths, and the squelch of boots fighting for a hold. Every soldier was acutely aware that a single dislodged stone, a single slip, a single cry of pain would echo up the gully. It would bring down a storm of German machine gun fire and mortar rounds, turning their ascent into a massacre. For hours they climbed, a silent chain of ghosts against the rock, their endurance and nerve tested with every foot of elevation gained. On the ridge above, the German sentries of the 278th Infantry Division huddled in their bunkers and machine gun nests. They were cold, wet, and tired, but confident. Their attention and the barrels of their MG-42s were fixed on the valley below, covering the killing grounds where they expected the next Allied assault. They listened to the wind and the rain, perhaps hearing the distant, muffled crump of artillery, sounds that were the normal background noise of the front. There was no military reason to watch their rear. German doctrine, and the very sight of the cliff behind them, confirmed their security. That rock face wasn't a flank, it was a wall. It was an impassable barrier that allowed them to concentrate all their firepower forward. In their minds, the position was not just strong, it was logically, fundamentally, unassailable from this direction. Just as the first hint of gray began to lighten the eastern sky, the lead Gurkha, exhausted and soaked to the bone, carefully pulled himself over the lip of the ridge. Then another, and another. They moved with a practiced stealth, melting into the shadows of the German perimeter. They were inside, undetected. They had climbed out of the impassable gully and were now behind the main line of concrete bunkers and machine gun posts. The physical ordeal of the climb was over. A new, sharper tension took its place. The company silently fanned out, moving into position, a line of coiled springs in the darkness, waiting for the signal. It came with the sudden, shocking blast of a whistle. In an instant, the pre-dawn quiet shattered. Grenades, thrown with precision, arced into weapon pits and bunker entrances. The Gurkhas charged forward, firing their rifles from the hip, shouting their war cry. Ayo Gurkhali! The Gurkhas are upon you. For the German defenders, the effect was one of absolute psychological devastation. They were attacked from a direction they thought was solid rock. The enemy was not in front of them, but among them. Soldiers were caught asleep, or scrambling for weapons, their command structure vaporizing in the initial seconds of chaos. The interlocking fields of fire that made Point 343 a fortress were now useless, pointing the wrong way. The organized, professional defense collapsed into a desperate, panicked fight for individual survival. The initial assault was a stunning success, a textbook example of surprise and shock. But taking the ridge was not the same as holding it. The fight was far from over, and the true cost of this victory was about to be counted. The fight to secure the summit was desperate and costly. As the surviving Germans regrouped, fighting back from isolated bunkers, C Company paid a price in blood. But to view this solely as a feat of Gurkha bravery is to miss the genius behind it. This was not a miracle. It was the calculated output of a system. The victory was engineered weeks before in the meticulous planning of British officers, the intelligence from daring night patrols, and the core doctrine of the British Indian Army. This doctrine fused British strategic command with the Gurkhas' unparalleled mountain skills, transforming what seemed like a superhuman act into a masterpiece of professional military logic. Amid the swirling chaos of the fight, the German defense was not yet broken. Surviving soldiers, recovering from the initial shock, fought back from isolated strongpoints. The battle for Point 343 hung in the balance. But one Gurkha section leader identified the linchpin of the entire position, a single, concrete-protected MG-42 machine gun. Its crew, still operating with disciplined fury, was pinning down any attempt to consolidate the ridge. The German gunners were focused forward, on the threat they could see. They never registered the silent movement in their own communication trench behind them. The Gurkha attack was not a charge. It was a swift, close-quarters resolution. A single grenade, followed by a short, decisive rush. In less than 10 seconds, the machine gun fell silent. That silence was the true turning point. For the other German defenders, the sudden absence of the MG-42's covering fire was a terrifying signal. Their anchor was gone. With enemies now deep inside their perimeter, the psychological collapse was immediate and total. The fortress was not just overrun. Its very logic had been dismantled from within. The ghosts who appeared on the ridge that morning were not supernatural. They were the product of a different kind of logic. The capture of Point 343 was a small victory with immense consequences. unhinging this sector of the Gothic line and saving countless lives that would have been spent against the guns in a frontal assault. It demonstrated a timeless principle of warfare. The most powerful physical defense is only as strong as the assumptions that underpin it. The Germans' greatest strength, that impassable cliff, created their greatest weakness. They were defeated not by overwhelming force, but by a precise attack on their certainty itself. The Germans had built their fortress on the assumption that the mountain was an impassable wall. The Gurkhas saw it differently. They did not fight the mountain, they simply used it.